Story 1. The Watchful Sedan. This all went down just a few months ago, and the unease still settles in my gut when I think about it. I'm an overnight worker at a sprawling warehouse, so my life is flipped. Sleep during the daylight hours, awake and alert from roughly 6 p.m. until 9 or 10 a.m. I stick to this schedule religiously, even on my days off. My body thrives on that consistency. One particular night, or rather early morning, I clocked out at the stark hour of 4 a.m. The drive home was an exercise in solitude. The roads were slick with a recent drizzle, reflecting the cold glow of the streetlights onto an otherwise deserted asphalt ribbon. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the world is holding its breath. As I turned onto my street and approached my house, a prickle of unease crawled up my neck. There, parked with an unnerving stillness right beside my driveway, was an old, black sedan. Its windows were tinted so heavily they looked like polished obsidian, utterly impenetrable. All its lights were off, making it a hulking, silent shadow in the pre-dawn gloom. I slowed my car to a crawl as I passed it, instinctively trying to pierce the darkness of its interior, but it was like staring into a void. I made the turn into my driveway, my eyes still flicking to the rearview mirror, trying to get a better look. Nothing. I pulled into the garage, the automatic door groaning shut behind me, and cast one last, lingering, uneasy glance down the driveway before I finally headed inside. The silence of my own home feeling suddenly fragile. My neighborhood isn't cramped. There's a decent amount of space between each home, meaning street parking is usually abundant. So for someone to park directly adjacent to my property, almost blocking my access, felt pointed, deliberate, unnecessary. I tried to rationalize it away. Maybe a neighbor was having a late-night gathering, and all the spots closer to their house were taken. It seemed unlikely at this hour, but I clung to the mundane explanation. An hour or so later, before finally succumbing to the exhaustion that pulled at my eyelids, I found myself peeking through the blinds. The street was empty. The car was gone. The relief was palpable, though a sliver of disquiet remained. The rest of that day passed in a blur of sleep. I woke around 6 p.m., the familiar routine of getting ready for another night shift kicking in. As I backed out of the driveway, I scanned the street. No sign of the black sedan. I mentally shrugged, pushing the incident to the back of my mind. My shift that night was more physically draining than usual, a relentless slog of lifting and sorting, and by the time it ended, I was bone-weary, looking forward to my upcoming night off with an almost desperate longing. I drove home, again through the deserted, sleeping streets, and then my stomach plummeted. There it was, the same black sedan, parked in the exact same spot, a silent, unmoving sentinel. This time, after the garage door rumbled shut, I didn't go straight inside. A knot of anxiety and anger tightened in my chest. I walked, cautiously, down to the end of my driveway. As I got closer, out of the very corner of my eye, I swore I saw a flicker of movement inside the car, a brief, indistinct shift behind that dark tint. My heart hammered against my ribs. Was it just a reflection on the wet glass, or was someone actually in there, watching? I stopped about 10 feet away, a primal fear keeping me from getting any closer. If someone was inside, I didn't want to provoke them. I strained my eyes, but the windows remained stubbornly opaque. Before I retreated into the dubious safety of my house, a sudden impulse made me fumble for my phone. I snapped a quick, slightly blurry photo of its license plate. Better safe than sorry, I told myself, though a grim part of me hoped I'd never have a reason to use it. Back inside, I locked everything, double-checked, and an hour later, peered out. Gone again. This was beyond strange. It was deeply unsettling, but since there was no direct harm, what could I even do? The next evening was my cherished night off. The sun had already bled below the horizon by the time I dragged myself out of bed. I checked the street immediately. No car, a small measure of relief. I decided to go for my usual long walk around the neighborhood, a ritual to clear my head and stretch my legs. The air was cool, the streets quiet. When I returned an hour later, my blood ran cold. It was there, parked, waiting. My mind reeled. I'd just walked the entire neighborhood and had seen maybe one or two other cars parked on the street. How had it reappeared so silently, so quickly? Why always right in front of my house? And only at night? This time, a surge of frustrated determination overrode some of my fear. I walked right up to it, my footsteps echoing unnervingly in the quiet. I cupped my hands against the driver's side window, pressing my face close to block out the reflections from the streetlights. The interior was empty. Utterly, completely empty. No people, no discarded items, nothing at all to offer even the faintest hint as to why it kept appearing. It was one of those profoundly odd situations where something felt terribly wrong, but because there was no overt threat, no tangible harm, it wasn't simple to know how to react. I went back inside, a deep sense of unease clinging to me like a shroud. The first thing I did was grab my phone, which I'd left charging on my nightstand while I was out. An unusual notification glowed on the screen. A motion detection alert from my security camera system. For reference, I had a camera on my front porch, but it was aimed specifically at the door, so it only ever triggered if someone was right there. I also had 3 cameras inside my home, covering the main living areas and my bedroom. The notification didn't specify which camera had detected motion. My fingers fumbled slightly as I opened the security app. There it was, a 60-second clip, saved by the system. I tapped play, my breath catching in my throat. For the first 55 seconds, the footage was utterly mundane. My bedroom, silent and still, bathed in the dim glow filtering in from the hallway light I always left on. I was just starting to think this was a misinput, a glitch in the system, a false alarm. But then, in the last 5 seconds of the video, something happened. A dark shape, a blur of sudden movement, streaked across the very bottom edge of the camera's view. It was incredibly quick, only in the frame for a fraction of a second, and only a partial glimpse, the top of a head, a sliver of shoulder. My hands went numb as I clutched the phone. The room in the footage, it was the bedroom I was currently standing in. Suddenly, the silence of the house wasn't comforting. It was deafening, oppressive. I could literally hear the frantic thumping of my heart in my ears, a wild drumbeat of terror. Slowly, as if moving through water, I began to turn, my eyes darting manically across the room, probing every shadow, every corner. They could be anywhere. They could be watching me right now. A torrent of horrifying thoughts rushed through my head, each one amplifying my panic. I needed to leave. I needed to get out. Realizing this with a surge of adrenaline, I lunged toward the doorway and out of the room. Instantly, I heard it. A distinct sound of movement from the bedroom right behind me, a rustle, a thud. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, heavy footsteps were rushing down the hallway towards me, closing the distance. They were maybe only 15 feet behind me, gaining. I scrambled down the stairs, my legs feeling like lead, fumbled frantically with the front door lock, and then sprinted right out into the relative cover of the woods that bordered my property. In the sheer intensity of that terrifying moment, I never even turned around to see who or what was chasing me. My entire focus was on getting out of there alive. Eventually, the only sounds were my own ragged, gasping breaths and the crunching of fallen leaves under my desperate feet, swallowed by the darkness of the woods. Trembling, I called 911. When the police finally arrived, the black sedan was, predictably, gone. But this time, I had the picture of their license plate. It only took them 3 hours to find and arrest him. He was a guy in his mid-20s, and when I later saw a picture, he looked completely deranged, his eyes holding a wild, unfocused stare. Honestly, if I'd turned back and seen that face chasing me through my own house, I probably would have been so terrified that I would have tripped or frozen or something equally fatal. The guy didn't seem to have any clear, rational reason for targeting me, but it was extremely, chillingly evident that he was targeting me. His phone contained multiple pictures of my house taken from various angles. Even worse, there were photos taken through my windows at night, images of me sitting in my living room, completely oblivious. He also had detailed notes on when I left for work and when I got home, every day for the last 2 weeks. Most disturbingly, we still don't know how he got into my home that night, or how he managed to evade the cameras for what might have been an extended period. If he was able to get in unnoticed once, there's no way to know if that was the first time he'd broken in. With how long and intently he was stalking me, he could have somehow gained knowledge of where all the cameras were positioned, their blind spots. It could have been that this was just the first time he'd made the mistake of slightly, fatally, walking into the view of one of the cameras in my bedroom. Regardless, I shouldn't have to worry about him for a long time, though the chilling memory, the violation, the sheer terror of it, that will linger far longer. Story 2. The Storm Rider. This happened about 4 years ago, but the memory still surfaces with a cold knot of dread, especially on stormy nights. I was working as an Uber driver back then, trying to make ends meet. This particular night, a vicious storm was tearing through town, the kind with lashing rain that blurred the world and wind that howled like a banshee. Nights like these were almost always dead slow for ride-hailing. Sometimes, I wouldn't even get a single pickup request for hours. Regardless, I always stayed out and waited, either driving around aimlessly, listening to music to stay awake, or finding an empty, well-lit parking lot and watching YouTube on my phone. Even if I only managed to snag a few pickups, it was still extra money that I wouldn't have made otherwise, and every dollar counted. This night was unfolding as expected. The storm was a powerful deterrent. Nobody sane was out or going anywhere if they could help it. For the first while, I holed up in a deserted supermarket parking lot, the rain drumming a relentless tattoo on the roof of my car, the wind rocking the vehicle gently. I sat on my phone, occasionally glancing up at the tempestuous world outside. After about an hour of this, feeling a bit restless, I went and drove through a nearby fast food joint to get some food, then returned to the same parking lot and waited some more, the scent of fries mingling with the damp air. Eventually, just as I was considering calling it a night, my phone chimed with that familiar notification. Someone had requested a pickup. I tapped on it. The app indicated they were a good 25 minutes away from my current location, and they needed to be dropped off another 20 minutes away from where they were. Usually, when this happens, it's because no other Uber drivers are working in that specific area, so I'll be the closest available driver, even if closest means a significant drive. I had nothing better to do this night, though, and the potential fare was decent. I accepted it and started heading over to them. They had placed the pinpoint location of where to pick them up with what seemed like precise accuracy on the map. The drive there felt like it took forever. Maybe it was the oppressive storm outside, the rain so heavy at times it was like driving through a waterfall, or just the eerie fact that absolutely nobody else was on the road. The world felt deserted, reclaimed by the elements. At certain points, the journey was so monotonous and isolated, I even almost forgot I was going to pick someone up. It felt more like I was just driving aimlessly into the dark, stormy void. It didn't help that the road the GPS was taking me down was leading me further and further out into what seemed like the middle of nowhere. I mean, I'm not even sure I've ever been that far in that particular direction before, because there was simply nothing out there. No houses, no businesses, just miles of dark fields and encroaching woodland. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably closer to 35 minutes of tense driving, I made it to the pinpointed location on the map. It was at the corner of two desolate, unlit country roads, but roads was a generous term. They were more like narrow, cracked asphalt tracks disappearing into the gloom. On either side of me were empty fields dissolving into dense stands of trees, their branches thrashing wildly in the wind. And more importantly, absolutely nobody was there. I confirmed on the app that I'd arrived at the location, then just sat in my car, engine idling, heater blasting, and looked around, peering through the rain-streaked windshield, wondering what the hell they were doing way out here, especially with a storm of this magnitude overhead. It was the kind of place you'd expect to find in a horror movie, not as an Uber pickup spot. After a minute or two of fruitless looking around, a growing sense of unease prickling at me. I looked down at my phone again and started typing a message to them, something along the lines of, "I've arrived. Where are you?" Just then, as my thumbs hovered over the send button, I saw someone in my driver's side mirror, a dark figure, materializing out of the tempestuous night, coming up quickly behind my car. Before I could even react, the back door on the passenger side opened, and they got in, water sluicing off them. I had no idea where they even came from. I never saw them on the road approaching, or even emerging from the dense line of trees. It was as if they'd simply coalesced out of the storm itself. The man was absolutely drenched in rain, his dark hair plastered to his skull, his clothes clinging to him. He had a disturbed, almost angry look on his face, his eyes shadowed and intense. "You order the Uber," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, betraying none of the sudden apprehension I felt. He responded by stating my first name, his voice low and gravelly, which confirmed he was indeed the right guy. I put the car in drive and started heading towards the destination he'd entered. A few minutes went by in strained silence, broken only by the thrum of the engine, the swish of the wipers, and the relentless drumming of rain. Something about him felt profoundly off. First of all, he was sitting directly in the middle of the back seats, which meant he was perfectly in view of my rear-view mirror every single time I looked back. It felt deliberate, like he wanted me to see him, or perhaps he was ensuring he had a clear view of me. And he also just had this really uneasy, volatile vibe, like he was a coiled spring, wound tight and ready to snap, like he was up to something nefarious. I really, desperately wanted to ask what brought him out to this God-forsaken patch of nowhere, and why he was out wandering in the pouring rain, but I also didn't want to cause any trouble or provoke a reaction I might regret. A stronger instinct told me to keep quiet. As we got further and further out, into what only looked to be even more uninhabited, desolate areas. The trees pressing closer to the road, the darkness seeming to thicken. I thought it best to try and break the tension, to ask, and maybe get an answer that would make me feel better, or at least give me some context. "Hey, so what brings you out here, anyway?" "I mean, with the storm and all," I said, trying to inject as friendly and non-confrontational a manner as possible into my voice. I looked at him in the mirror. His eyes, which had been fixed on something unseen outside his window, darted away from mine as soon as they met my gaze. He looked like he was going to say something, his lips parting slightly, but then he didn't. He completely ignored the question, turning his head to stare out the window again, his silence now feeling actively hostile, his whole demeanor screaming suspicion. That didn't make me feel good at all. In fact, it did the opposite. Even worse, the guy seemed to get antsy now, shifting in his seat, looking around more, and keeping an unsettlingly close eye on me in the mirror. Having to focus on the treacherous road with the rain pouring down on the windshield, visibility almost nil at times. It was really unnerving not being able to constantly see what he was up to behind me. But then he suddenly spoke, his voice sharp, abrupt, and commanding. "Drop me off here." Confused because we were still in the middle of absolutely nowhere, with no discernible landmarks or signs of habitation, I started to ask if he was sure, if this was really the place. But he cut me off, repeating himself with more force, his voice laced with an undeniable demand. "Drop me off here!" Something was clearly, terribly wrong, and I wanted no part of whatever it was. I did as he said, immediately pulling over to the muddy shoulder of the road. He moved toward the door to leave, but as he did, I caught his eyes, for a split second, having to glance at my phone, which was sitting on the center console with the Uber app still open, displaying the trip details. He put his hand on the door handle, but hesitated. After a brief, charged pause, he glanced back at my phone, then, significantly, pulled his own phone out of his pocket and checked it for something. Somehow, in that gut-wrenching moment, I knew exactly what was going through his head. He'd been reminded, perhaps by seeing my app or by checking his own, that the Uber app had his full name, his payment details, everything. And so, whatever he was up to, whatever sinister plan he might have had, that I was clearly, and perhaps dangerously, suspicious about, would be linked directly back to him. I knew it the second I saw his eyes flicker to my phone, the realization setting into him like a cold dawn. Don't worry," I blurted out, my voice a little shaky, hoping to redirect his thoughts, and, in a way, fake that I wasn't suspicious of anything, and that by cancelling it, maybe he'd think his info would be deleted or somehow obscured. "I'll cancel the ride from my end. It won't charge you." He glared at me, his eyes still holding that angry, cold, almost dead look. After another few seconds of intense, silent hesitation, he finally wrenched the door open and left, stepping out into the raging storm. He walked out into the deluge and was hidden, swallowed by the dense fog and driving rain, within seconds. I drove away immediately, flooring the accelerator, not waiting to see if he might change his mind. Even though I had basically no concrete evidence that this guy was up to anything truly illegal, his behavior was so alarming, so off, that I still quickly reported the incident and his behavior to the police as soon as I was in a safer, more populated area. You just never know. Several days went by with nothing. I tried to put it out of my mind. Then I got a really unfortunate, chilling call from the local police department. Someone had gone missing that night, a local hiker, last seen near the sprawling national forest that was just off the road where I picked the man up from. They called for more information on what happened that night, the timeline, his description, anything I could remember. After giving them everything I could, every detail I could dredge up, they didn't find him, or anything else. Unfortunately, with the severity of the storm that night, any tracks, any potential evidence, was likely washed away and gone by the time any proper searches could be made. They never found the missing person, and they never found the man I picked up. I was the last known person to encounter him. I think, with a certainty that still sends a shiver down my spine, that I'm really incredibly lucky that I didn't go missing that night as well. Story 3. The Lingering Presence. This particular day started like any other dreary weekday in early April, a time of year around here when the rain seems to fall with a relentless, soul-dampening persistence. My job, which involved a frustrating mix of indoor and partially outdoor tasks, was always 10 times worse when it was raining. It wore me out, physically and mentally. By the time my shift was finally over at 6 p.m. that evening, I was thoroughly exhausted and soaked through, despite my supposedly waterproof gear. The 30-minute drive home, to my house, which was nestled away in a quiet, rural part of town, was through a constant, heavy downpour that turned the roads into slick, reflective ribbons. Strangely, as I pulled down my long, unpaved driveway, which was just a churned-up morass of mud at this point from all the relentless rain, I noticed another set of tire tracks. They were distinct from my own, clearly made by a different vehicle, and looked like another car had recently driven down to my house. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was perhaps a mail truck making a late delivery, or maybe a courier with a package, though that was unusual for my remote location. It wasn't until I got inside, shaking off the rain like a wet dog, and noticed no mail or deliveries at my doorstep, that a small flicker of oddity registered. Odd, but from the look of the tracks in the mud, it seemed like when they got to the house, they just did a 3-point turn in the wider area near my porch and left. Probably just made a wrong turn, I reasoned, dismissing it as I peeled off my soaked work uniform. I went to the kitchen to whip up something quick and warm for dinner, the sound of the rain a constant drumming companion. It was maybe 7:30 p.m., and I was in the living room, half watching some mindless show, when I thought I heard a knock somewhere by the front door. I say thought because it was only a single, faint knock, and it was kind of quiet, almost tentative. Plus, with the incessant rain hammering against the roof and windows, and the wind occasionally rattling the old sashes, it was hard to hear anything clearly. I got up from the living room couch and walked to the other side of the house to check the front door. When I opened it, I was smacked in the face by a gust of cold rain and wind, and yet nobody was even on my porch. I looked around for a few seconds, peering into the gloomy, rain-swept yard, before quickly shutting the door to save myself from getting drenched. It was probably nothing anyway, I told myself. A branch hitting the house, or just the storm playing tricks. I went back to the living room where I was watching my show while scrolling aimlessly on my phone. Nothing really happened for a while, at least an hour, maybe more, before I got up from the couch to use the bathroom. When I walked out of the living room, though, heading towards the hall, I noticed something really weird. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. There was a mark on the floor, just outside the living room archway. It looked like a small, distinct smear of dirt or mud, which really stood out because the tile floors in the hallway were a stark white. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I didn't wear my shoes through the house, especially not with them being as muddy and wet as they were from outside. I always took them off at the door. Also, I was confused as to how I didn't notice it before. Where the spot was located was basically right behind my couch, which faced the other direction because the TV was on the far wall. I would have had to walk right past it multiple times. I grabbed a paper towel from the kitchen and wiped it up, but still felt really weird and unsettled about it. It seemed like it was going to be just one of those inexplicable little things that happen sometimes, where you never really understand it, but it's not exactly meaningful or harmful in any way, so you just try to forget about it and move on. Thing is, it did cross my mind, however briefly and unpleasantly, that maybe it was from someone else, but that felt more like me just scaring myself over nothing, letting the gloomy weather and isolation get to me. I used the bathroom, then went back to the couch. I'd be lying if I said I just forgot about it, though. This felt different, somehow more significant than a random, unexplained occurrence. I had a bad gut feeling about it, a persistent thrum of anxiety I couldn't shake. I couldn't help but constantly check over my shoulder, sensing or imagining I was sensing that I was being watched. It was like that creepy feeling you get after watching a particularly effective horror movie, but amplified by the solitude and the storm. With the couch set up the way it was, the whole bottom floor of the house, the kitchen, the dining area, the hallway to the front door, and the stairs, was behind me, which kind of felt deeply unsettling now. The shadows cast by the single lamp seemed deeper, more menacing. It got to the point where I was so uncomfortable, so on edge, that I had to turn the TV off. The silence that descended was almost worse, filled only with the sounds of the storm. I decided to go upstairs to my bedroom. At least in there, I could be in my bed, backed up against a solid wall, without that constant, nagging feeling that something or someone was behind me. I had a small TV in there as well, so I just continued with my night, trying to replicate the same sense of normalcy I had downstairs. 20 or so minutes passed, and feeling marginally more comfortable and secure in my room, I was just starting to forget about everything, to let the tension ease, when I suddenly heard something from outside my bedroom door. I'm not sure what exactly it sounded like. It was just a muted thump, indistinct but definite. Maybe a footstep on the old wooden floorboards of the landing, or something soft hitting the wall. I didn't know, but it was enough to make me instantly feel unsettled again. My brief respite shattered. My heart rate kicked up. I got out of bed, my feet silent on the carpet, and walked slowly up to the door. I put my ear against the cool wood and listened intently. I didn't hear anything else, just the muffled roar of the rain outside. I stood in place for a moment, frozen by indecision, while I gathered up the courage to open the door, telling myself I had to make sure nothing was going on, that I was just being paranoid. I took a deep breath, gripped the doorknob, and opened the door, peering out into the dimly lit hallway. It was empty and quiet. I knew then, with a sinking feeling, that if I wanted any kind of a peaceful night, if I was ever going to relax, I'd have to check around the rest of the house as well, at least the upstairs. The only other room upstairs besides my bedroom and the bathroom was the spare bedroom, which was a rarely used, cluttered space that doubled as a sort of library and home office. I started to walk over towards the spare room door, my senses on high alert. Then, out of nowhere, the TV downstairs suddenly turned on, blasting at full volume. I could suddenly hear the dialogue and sound effects from the show I'd been watching earlier being played at an ear-splitting level. My heart burned in my chest from the sheer shock and terror that just shot through me. It was so sudden, so loud, so unexpected. I sprinted down the hallway, my bare feet pounding on the floorboards, and ran frantically downstairs. The whole ground floor was dark, except for the garish, flickering light of the TV screen, which was casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls of the living room. I turned the corner into the living room, my breath catching in my throat, unsure what horrifying thing to expect. But nobody was in there. The room was empty. I carefully and cautiously walked up to the TV, my eyes scanning the whole room, every shadowy corner, as I did, and used the physical button on the back of the set to turn it off. The sudden silence was almost as jarring as the noise. Was this somehow just the TV glitching out in a spectacular fashion due to a power surge from the storm? Or was someone actually, malevolently going on? All the random, unsettling things that had happened that night, the tire tracks, the faint knock, the mud smear, the thump upstairs, all just kind of added up, painting a deeply disturbing picture. I grabbed a large chef's knife from the kitchen block, its cold steel a small, inadequate comfort in my trembling hand, and began systematically clearing every area of the house. I should have called the cops right then and there, I know that now. But honestly, in the heat of the moment, in that state of heightened fear and confusion, it didn't seem like it would be much of a help if someone was actually there, because given my rural location, they wouldn't make it for another 10 or 15 minutes at least. By then, who knew what could happen? Anyway, I cleared the whole first floor, kitchen, dining room, living room, laundry, closets, and through all of it, I never found even a single other thing out of place or off about the house. Nothing. I then quietly, stealthily, walked back upstairs, my heart still pounding, but a part of me starting to believe, or desperately hope, that this was all just a bizarre string of unusual but ultimately meaningless events, my imagination running wild. I got up to the hallway and walked to the spare room, creaking open the door. I hadn't been in there for a while, but it all looked the same. Dusty books, old furniture, boxes, until I noticed something small and dark laying on the floor by the closet, partially obscured by a fallen stack of magazines. It was the TV remote for the one downstairs. Blood rushed from my face, replaced by an icy dread. I backed up slowly, then turned and ran, stumbling blindly down the stairs and bursting out of the front door into the cold, driving rain, fumbling for my phone as I called the police. Sure enough, when they finally arrived, lights flashing eerily through the storm, they found a couple of other subtle signs that someone else had indeed been inside my home, including a broken lock on one of the downstairs windows, one tucked away at the back of the house, likely how they'd gained entry. The police theorized, and it made a terrifying kind of sense, that whoever it was had likely visited my house earlier in the day while I was at work. Those initial tire tracks, the soft knock, perhaps an attempt to see if I was home. After realizing I wasn't, they probably drove away, only to come back later under the cover of darkness and the storm to break in. They were likely inside the entire night, quietly lurking, moving stealthily around the house. Maybe they really were watching me all that time. I felt uneasy. It still makes me shiver uncontrollably just thinking about it. When I went up to my bedroom, they must have been downstairs, perhaps even in the living room with me for a time. And then, when I went upstairs, they must have grabbed the TV remote. Obviously, they turned it on to distract me, to lure me back downstairs, just as I was walking up to the spare room where they were evidently hiding, giving them enough time to slip out of the house, undetected in the chaos. It's almost 100 times creepier, more disturbing, that nothing was taken, and no clear signs showed what they were there for, what their intentions were. That lingering uncertainty is a horror in itself, Hopefully, if anything else ever happens, I'll still be around to update you on it. But I pray I never have to. If these stories sent a shiver down your spine, hit that like button. Let the darkness know you were listening. And for more tales from the abyss, subscribe and ring that bell. You won't want to miss what lurks around the next corner.